In this presentation, we're going to discuss cancer epidemiology. Cancers are caused by either environmental lifestyle factors, but also they can be caused by genetic factors as well. The patterns of cancer are influenced by not only our environment and lifestyle, but can be due to chronic inflammation. First, we're going to look at the genetic and epigenetic alterations and abnormalities that drive cancer at the cellular level. And then we'll talk about stromal tissue immune cells that promote chronic inflammation. So there are critical cancer genes that include our oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes, and they become altered by a combination of both genetic and epigenetic alterations. Now, critical genes for cancer will be the ones that are regulating whether the cell itself is growing, whether it's dividing, whether it differentiates, or it dies. There are a subclass of tumor suppressor genes that help maintain the integrity of the genome. And although there are some genetic alterations, there's a wealth of information now that indicates the importance of this epigenetic process, especially when it results into gene silencing, which means that the gene is not broken, but it's just mute, it's just at bay. There's different combinations of mutations and epigenetic changes that can be found within the different types of cancers. We know that with neoplastic cells, they undergo dynamic and reversible transitions. The plasticity is enabled by changes in this epigenetic regulation. So what are the interacting factors that you need to think about that influence your cancer risk? These can include detoxifying enzymes, DNA repair genes, our own immune and inflammatory systems, as well as the cell's immediate environment. The biological environment that surrounds our cells, this will include metabolic and hormonal factors. Let me give you an example. When a patient has excess estrogen production, inflammation, maybe disordered glucose and lipid metabolism, this could all put them at a higher risk for cancer. But the cell's biologic environment also comes into play because it can be modified by metabolic requirements, physical activity, infections, nutrition, occupational hazards like carcinogens and air pollution, and there's another range of environmental factors that play into this also. Now, in terms of the science, investigators are challenged to connect this complexity between genotype, phenotype, and all the environment lifestyle factors that come together and develop cancer. Now, moving on to the stromal tissue immune cells. Now, think about the development and the progression can involve the microenvironment, or what we call the stroma, of the cell. And the microenvironment participates in complex signaling processes that facilitate the promotion of tumors. They also facilitate metastasis, so the growing and development of cancer, because stromal tissue has various immune cells that promote inflammation. And this stromal tissue inflammation can proceed and initiate the changes that we see in cancer. It's very well documented in the literature that chronic inflammation induced by bacteria, viruses, autoimmune processes, and toxins can promote common types of cancer, which include but are not limited to colon cancer, liver cancer, and even lung cancer. Now think about the inflammation that's caused by the environmental factors and pollutants in our own lives. Maybe inhaling tobacco smoke, asbestos fibers, or fine particles in the air from engines on the freeway, or if you work in an industrial environment, maybe those things can promote cancer. Now, the sources are major factors in lung cancer and in other respiratory tract cancers as well. And again, they include tobacco, asbestos, diesel engine exhausts, and the other industrial type environmental pollutants. Now, this cancer development in the presence of chronic inflammation, it not only is triggered by these sources, but it involves the continuous presence of various components in our own body. Think of cytokines, chemokines, reactive oxygen species, oncogenes. We also have COX-2, 5-LOX, which is 5-lipooxygenase, and MMPs, matrix metalloproteinases, as well as the activation of transcription factors. Unfortunately, we have to think about the trends of cancer, and it's reported that cancer itself has become a major cause of both morbidity and mortality, not only in the US, but worldwide, all regions of the world. And it's estimated that 14.1 million cancer cases and 8.2 million cancer deaths are reported. 32.6 million people are known to be living with cancer currently. Now, the age standardization rate for all cancers, except for the non-melanoma skin cancers for men and women, is about 182 per 100,000 individuals. Now, though this rate is a little outdated, it does tell us the gravity and the importance of cancer. When the study was done in 2012, the highest cancer rate for men and women together was found in Denmark. And in that country, the age standardization rate was higher. Now think about this. In 9 countries, Denmark, France, Australia, Belgium, Norway, the US, Ireland, and Korea, as well as the Netherlands, the age standardization rate is at least 300 per 100,000. So you can see which countries are being plagued with cancer at a higher rate. The countries in the top 10 come from Europe, North America, Asia, and Oceania. Now, we know that liver cancer incidences are much higher than men, and with lung cancer, the incidence actually has decreased, and this corresponds with the message that tobacco smoke and tobacco use increases your risk of lung cancer. And as this message went out worldwide, the incidence of lung cancer has decreased. Now, in the US specifically, the rate of cancer for men has overall decreased, but for women, it stayed about the same. However, for patients that are under 19 years old or 19 and younger, have actually seen an increase in the amount of cancer. In the US, alcohol overuse contributes to about 8 to 16% of all liver cancer deaths. And research continues to show that there is a decline in cancer death rates and mortality for men, women, and children. However, you can see that the death rates for liver cancer is increased at the highest rate of all the cancers, and men having more than double the rate of women. In more recent numbers, for every 15,500 or so deaths among men, there have been about 7,400 deaths among women. Now, we want to think about how cancer um, derives, right? The etiology of these certain cancers. And it's widely accepted that there's a longer latency period that precedes the onset of the adult cancers, which would make sense, right? They had more time to develop. And so these cancers are being found in older adulthood. The data suggests that the events that happen earlier on in our lives influences our susceptibility to chronic diseases and thus the chronic diseases that could lead to cancer. Now, specifically, the developmental origins hypothesis. This is what it postulates. It says that nutrition and other environmental factors affect our cellular pathways not only when we are living, but also during gestation, enabling a single genotype to produce a broad range of adult phenotypes. It's really interesting because it all begins in utero and not only in early life. So it's not just, as we are born and we live, the environmental factors and what we choose to do, our lifestyle, but also what happens in utero, which means that it starts with the maternal and paternal nutrition and the environment that is associated with our parents. And it can increase the susceptibility to cancer and other adult onset chronic diseases. Now, throughout utero development, the placenta does play a major role because it controls our growth and development when we're babies, when we're fetuses. And because the placenta regulates the intrauterine environment, we have to be very careful what gets exposed through pregnancy. Early versus late undernutrition in pregnancy indicates that the first trimester of pregnancy is particularly vulnerable to disease and disease outcome in later adulthood. So, what you eat in the first trimester, and oftentimes many women don't realize that they're pregnant yet for quite some time, but it's this time that makes all the difference. The nutrients B12, folic acid, choline, these will actually be altered and can alter the DNA sequences when there is a deficiency in early gestation. And this was found in rat models. So we would see silencing or switching the gene off and on. It's linked to prenatal diet, such as diseases like diabetes, obesity, and even cancer. So, as we are thinking about this a little bit more, we realize that we need to understand nutrition in pregnancy and how it's linked to the vulnerabilities that are found in later life. Here are some important things to consider. The risk factors for cancer. We've talked about them, but just so that you can see in a clear schematic. So we have to break out the environmental factors versus the lifestyle factors. In terms of environment, you think of the things around you every day: air pollution, radiation, even sunlight, and then the occupational hazards. If you work on a construction site, maybe there's asbestos or other small particles in the air. Lifestyle factors include things that we choose to take into our body or that affect our body: smoking, alcohol, our diet or nutrition, the amount of physical exercise, sexual practices, infections, and obesity can also be considered lifestyle factors. Now, our lifestyle plus our exposures to particular carcinogens or things that occur in our work, so occupational exposures, they all contribute to an altered epigenomic mark on our DNA. And these can have expressions of tumor suppressor genes and oncogenes that increase the susceptibility to cancer. We are going to move in and talk about some of these factors, beginning with the use of tobacco, our diet and nutrition. We'll talk a little bit about obesity, alcohol consumption, physical activity, and then we'll end with air pollution. Now, tobacco use causes many different cancers, and it's the most important cause of the preventable cancers. Cigarette smoking is carcinogenic, meaning cancer causing, and close to 40 million adults just in the US still smoke despite understanding or knowing about the risk of tobacco. In the US, cigarette smoking is the leading cause. It's a leading cause, and it accounts for more than 480,000 deaths every year. That is 1 in every 5 deaths, or 20%. And those Americans that smoke live with smoking-related disease, if not cancer. That's about 16 million Americans. Also to note, worldwide, tobacco use is also a preventable cause of premature death and disease, accounting for 5.4 million people who die each year from tobacco-related illnesses worldwide. And the risk is going to be greater for those who started smoking when they were young, and then they continue throughout their life and they don't stop, or they stop when perhaps it may be a little too late. Tobacco smoke is linked to lung cancer, but also aerodigestive tract cancers. So think of cancers of the mouth, the pharynx, the larynx, even nasal cavity cancers, your sinuses, your esophagus. Smoking tobacco is also linked to stomach cancers, lower urinary tract cancers like bladder cancers, penile cancers, renal pelvic cancers, so in the kidneys, your pancreas, your cervix, your uterus, all linked to cigarette smoking. Even cancers of the blood like myeloid leukemia. However, there's a new list of disease risks that include a higher risk associated between smoking tobacco, liver cancer, as well as smoking tobacco and colorectal cancer as well. So we talk about cigarette smoking or tobacco use, but we're also talking about e-cigarettes, cigar, pipe smoking, and even what used to be called secondhand smoke, environmental tobacco smoke, or ETS. These are all harmful as well. Tobacco smoke affects all areas of our body, nearly every body organ. It's important to understand the dietary factors that increase your risk for cancer, but it can be difficult to understand these factors. The ways in which diet affects the likelihood of developing cancer is very complicated. It's not just because of the variety of foods consumed, but also the constituents of food, the metabolic consequences of eating something specific, and the temporal changes and patterns of how we use this type of food. In older adults, the cancer risks can depend on what they were eating earlier in life. We talked about it. There's new studies that are showing that it's not just what we ate, but also what our parents ate. But it also is determined by our current eating practices. It's very challenging to think about the association, what type of target diets we need to consider or to strive for, because we have to think about the measurements of specific nutrients, food types, and dietary patterns. And this research is ongoing. And if you're interested in this, uh, nutrigenomics is an area of specificity that studies nutrition and the phenotype variability of individuals based on our own genomic differences. It's very exciting and cutting edge information. Though it seems like it should be very basic, right? Food should be medicine. Data from research that examines the epidemiology of cancer has revealed that lifestyle and nutrition are associated with the progression as well as the development of major human cancers. And some of the cancers that we're talking about are commonly breast cancer, prostate cancer, colorectal tumors, and other diet related cancers. And the bioactive dietary components have been implicated as promoting or protecting the factors in cancer development. So, for example, food components that are reported to have cancer preventative potential, these include polyphenols, selenium, methyl groups, retinoids, allele compounds, and we also have mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. But humans are constantly exposed to a variety of compounds that are considered toxic or mutagenic. These toxic compounds are sometimes called xenobiotics, and they also include carcinogenic chemicals. Now, many of these chemicals are found in our own human diet, surprisingly. Most xenobiotics are transported in the blood by our lipoproteins, so they connect to one another, and then they penetrate the lipid membranes, and therefore they can move throughout the body. They react with cellular macromolecules such as proteins and DNA, and they can react directly with other cell structures that can cause overall damage to the cells. Our body has two main defense systems for counteracting these effects. We have enzymes that can help detoxify, and we also have an antioxidant system. We have enzymes which help us to maintain and metabolize the environmental carcinogens that enter our bodies through nutrition. We also have reactive oxygen species that help to do this as well. GSTs are an example of these enzyme housekeepers. Now, our patients that lack these enzymes may be at higher risk for cancers because of decreased capacity to dispose of activated carcinogens. Their reactive oxygen species and other enzyme housekeepers are not working well to help prevent cancers. Obesity causes numerous health conditions, as well as an inactive lifestyle. But research has significantly been able to prove that obesity is a risk factor for cancer. And now we understand the difference in the relationship between being overweight and obesity, our energy balance, and cancer risk, reoccurrence, and survival. Now, how do we determine if someone is overweight or obese? We use the BMI or body mass index, and this is what is useful when you are reading these research articles to understand. And we know that a higher BMI is linked to an increased risk of developing 11 types of cancers. So, liver, advanced prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, gallbladder, kidney, colorectal, esophageal, postmenopausal breast cancer, pancreatic, endometrial, stomach cancer. These that have been identified, we know and we have sufficient evidence that the absence of body fatness will lower the cancer risk for these things, but also for thyroid and multiple myeloma. Obesity is recognized as being a poor prognostic factor if you are diagnosed with these cancers. And what that means is that the prognosis of you recovering from this cancer is decreased if you have an elevated BMI. Now, the mechanisms of obesity-associated cancers are unclear still, and even the risk factors. We don't know everything about this. We know that there's a connection, and it varies by the type of tumor and the distribution of the body fat. Now, not everybody that weighs 300 pounds, the body fat is distributed the same. So there's also that connection as well. But we know that there's three main factors that are related to obesity and cancer. The first one is the insulin and insulin-like growth factor axis, our sex hormones, and also adipokines or adipocyte-derived cytokines. Those are the three main factors. And they are linked to metabolic dysregulation of our adipose tissue or our fat tissue, and our endocrine and paracrine altered signaling of this adipose tissue in obesity. Alcohol increases our risk as well. And we noted earlier that not only does cigarette smoking and tobacco smoking, or just tobacco products in general, increase our risk for some of these type cancers, but alcohol does the same for mouth, pharynx, larynx, esophagus cancers. We also see an increase in liver cancer, colorectal cancer, and breast cancers with alcohol consumption. And there is no safe limit of intake, and many times patients want to know what that is. They want a number, but the evidence does not provide that. The effect is from ethanol regardless of what type of drink. So it doesn't matter if it is a top shelf or a mid-range price alcohol drink, or if it's beer. Okay, if it has ethanol in it, it increases your risk for cancer. And according to the International Agency for Cancer Research, or the IACR, alcohol is classified as a human carcinogen. Modifiable causes of premature death in middle-aged patients in Western Europe included smoking, poor diet, overweight, obesity, hypertension, physical activity, and excessive alcohol consumption. So this is in patients over age 70. There's also several factors that contribute to alcohol-induced cancer development. So not only is it ethanol, but also it includes acetaldehyde, oxidative stress, if there's nutritional deficiencies, especially folate and B vitamin that often occur with alcoholism. And then there's variations in several genes that actually modulate the risk of alcohol-induced carcinogens as well. Physical activity is linked to cancer. There are studies that suggest that regular exercise will decrease the risk of breast cancer, colon cancer, endometrial cancer, and it's independent of weight changes. It's just the physical exercise, the increase in heart rate and blood pumping. The World Cancer Research Fund summarized in their paper the effects as convincing for cancers of colorectal and probable for postmenopausal breast cancer and endometrial cancer. Physical exercise is important. Annual deaths that are attributable to physical inactivity have been reported between 3.2 and 5.3 million deaths per year. We know that there is irrefutable evidence that shows the effectiveness of regular physical activity in primary and secondary prevention of chronic diseases that could lead to cancer. And these chronic diseases include cardiovascular diseases, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, depression, osteoporosis, premature death, and cancer. But there's also some biological mechanisms that suggest that physical activity can protect against cancers of the breast and endometrium because it decreases insulin and IGF levels, and it decreases your obesity. It alters inflammatory mediators, which will decrease then oncogenes. It will decrease the levels of circulating sex hormones and metabolic hormones as well, which will improve your overall immune function and enhance the cytochrome P450 activity, which modifies carcinogen activation. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, has done a lot of research that shows that there's an increase in mortality and morbidity, which will shorten your life expectancy, from cardiovascular, respiratory disease, and lung cancer, all linked to ambient air pollution. The World Health Organization concurs with this as well. Long-term exposure to the fine particles that are found in air pollution caused 4.2 million deaths and 103 million lost years of healthy living in the study that they published in 2015. It is the 5th ranked global risk factor. Now, when we talk about particulate matter or particulate pollution, this is a mixture of very, very fine particles as well as liquid droplets in the air. And it's made of acids like nitrates and sulfates, organic chemicals, metals, soil, and even dust particles. And these very fine and ultrafine particles can be easily absorbed by our lungs, which then triggers phagocytosis by macrophages and neutrophils. When the macrophages and neutrophils come out to play, they're going to release tissue-damaging inflammatory mediators. So think of your exposure to maybe diesel exhaust. You're changing your tire on the freeway, and how many cars and trucks and vehicles are passing during this time? Well, all that exhaust that you're consuming contains fine particles which are linked to lung cancer, throat cancer. It's linked to eye irritations, asthma attack, myocardial ischemia, and irritations of your eyes, ears, nose, throat. Now, overall, the fine particle pollution is linked to other health problems like premature death in people with heart and lung disease, so pre-existing. It can also be linked to non-fatal heart attacks, irregular heartbeats. It can aggravate asthma. It can decrease your overall lung function and cause other respiratory symptoms like coughing, shortness of breath, and irritation of your airway. Now, we talked a lot about outdoor air pollution, but what about indoor air pollution? It's generally considered to be worse, partly because of cigarette smoke or environmental tobacco smoke. And it can cause the formation of reactive oxygen free radicals, which will then damage your DNA. Environmental tobacco smoke is classified as a human carcinogen. Studies in China have shown that in some regions, they have very high levels of lung cancer in women who spend time out indoors. They spend the majority of their time indoors. And the exposures from heating and cooking combustion could be identified as the risk factors for lung cancer. So, oil vapors and other volatile toxicants that can occur from cooking inside. Also, domestic coal use and environmental tobacco smoke increases the risk of lung cancer in women and men. So we already talked about tobacco smoke, but now we're just talking about indoor air pollution, and that's why we are discussing it again. Now, radon is a natural radioactive gas that's derived from radioactivity decay of uranium, and this is ubiquitous in rock and soil. We have this in our homes if we have anything with rock and soil in it, and it can be trapped in our houses, and it's giving off this radioactive decaying. Also can be carcinogenic to us. So the most hazardous houses that are identified by testing can be modified then to prevent further radon contamination. And so whose houses are going to be more at risk? Well, if they have underground mines or live near a mine, this can put their house at increased risk. And most of the lung cancers that are associated with radon are going to be bronchogenic type cancers, like small cell carcinoma. Can also, though, be at a higher frequency in underground miners, so someone that mines for a living. It does increase the risk for lung cancer in these miners, whether they smoke or not. It's just the radon, it's not just the tobacco smoke. Which of the following is true regarding environmental risk factors and the development of cancer? Is it chronic alcoholism that's linked to lung cancer? Is it the human papillomavirus that causes liver cancer? Is it ultraviolet radiation linked to breast cancer, or physical activity reducing the risk of breast cancer and colon cancer? So which of these statements is true? If you picked D, you're correct. Physical activity has been linked to the reduction of not only breast cancer, but also colon cancer. Chronic alcoholism has been linked to oral, esophageal, and liver cancer. And HPV is linked to cervical cancer. And ultraviolet radiation causes basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and it is the principal source of ultraviolet rays, being sunlight. So moving on to ionizing radiation, and much of what we know about ionizing radiation on human cancer comes from watching and observing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bomb exposures. The atomic bomb exposures that occurred in Japan caused acute leukemias in both adults and children, and it did increase the frequency of thyroid and breast cancers as well. We also seen an uptick in lung, stomach, colon, esophageal, and urinary tract cancers, as well as multiple myelomas. At Nagasaki and Hiroshima, leukemia incidences in patients 15 years or younger peaked at 6 to 7 years after the explosion had happened. And then patients 45 years and older, at the time of the exposure, they actually had a latent period of 20 years before developing acute leukemia. So again, if you were 15 years or younger, you saw symptoms within 6 or 7 years. But if you were 45 years or older, it took about 20 years for it to develop. So the age at the time of radiation exposure is another important factor in radiation-induced cancer. Children that are exposed to radiation for medical intervention, they suggest excessive relative risks, or what we call ERRs, excessive relative risk, for radiation-induced cancers. At a given age, it's going to be exceptionally higher for those exposed during childhood than those that are exposed at older age. And so just think about Nagasaki and Hiroshima when you're trying to make the connection of excessive relative risk. Now, There is a long-held assumption that cellular alterations, like mutations and malignant transformations that happen in our body, occur only in cells directly irradiated. But there's evidence that indicates that cells that are not directly radiated, but they're just near the other cells that have been exposed, can also receive signals from irradiated cells and can participate in the overall damage response. And it's now known that cells that are not directly exposed to radiation, but just they are the progeny of the cell, so they are what derives from that cell, can also express high levels of gene mutations and lethality, meaning the cells are very lethal, and aberrations in the chromosome. So there are issues with the DNA itself. And altogether, these things create a genomic instability, which initiates cancer, increases the progression of cancer, and also will affect the prognosis of cancer. The directly irradiated cells can also lead to genetic effects, and we call this effects on the bystander cells, or the innocent cells, right? They weren't the ones we were targeting, but now there's an issue with those cells as well. The bystander effect can be induced through cellular communication because the irradiated cells can speak to the non-radiated cells, so to speak. They're signals that mediate the cellular communication. So what mediates this communication? Cytokines, reactive oxygen species, and nitric oxide or oxidative stress can mediate the cellular communication between irradiated and non-irradiated cells. Even microRNAs can be transferred between these cells through the small gap junctions. Acute exposure to irradiation can cause damage to our organ systems, especially with highly proliferative cells such as a hematopoietic system, so cells that can virtually grow into anything. Also our skin and our GI system. And what researchers are now starting to think or postulate is that radiation's carcinogenic potential will persist because of non-targeted radiation effects that alter the cell and tissue signaling. It changes the microenvironment. There's increasing evidence that shows radiotherapy leads to alterations in our tumor microenvironment, especially our cells that incorporate the immune system. Why do we use radiotherapy? Well, actually, radiotherapy is a treatment for cancer with improvement in cancer survival. Now, the long-term risk of second cancer and other disorders from treatment becomes important when you're thinking about radiotherapy. Radiation-induced cancer in humans also has a latent period that we need to think about, meaning that usually 5 to 10 years after, but it can also be decades after as well. Using the U.S. Surveillance, Epidemiology, and End Results data, or the SEER data, the estimated excess of second cancers that could be related to radiotherapy is about 8%. And this data comes from a study from the UK, which included the diagnostic procedures and excluded therapeutic irradiation. This yielded an estimation of 15%. Ultraviolet radiation, or what we get from our sunlight, is produced in specialized lights also, like tanning lamps, black lights. And the most preventable cause of skin cancer is really reducing the exposure to ultraviolet light. And this is either going to be from the sun itself or from the artificial sources that were mentioned. Now, let's say someone tans really poorly and they get freckles on their skin or they burn easily after being out in the sun. These individuals are going to be more susceptible to developing skin cancers. There's three main types. There's the cancers that form from melanocytes, or the cells that provide our pigment, and we also call those cancers melanomas because they're from melanocytes. Then we have cancers in the lower part of the epidermis, or the outer layer of the skin, and these are called basal cell carcinomas, or BCCs. But there's also squamous cell carcinomas, or SCCs, and these are cancers in the flat cells that form the surface of the skin. Again, these are called squamous cell carcinomas. Which one is the most lethal? Melanomas, the ones that are derived from melanocytes, or their pigmented cells, this is the most lethal form of skin cancer, and it can occur on any skin surface, and also it can come from the mucosal surfaces of other sites where there is a neural crest cell that will then migrate. In men, often melanocytes are on the skin on the head and the neck, between the shoulders and in the hips. In women, it's more common that we find melanoma on the lower legs, between the shoulders, and on the hips. And although it's rare in people with darker skin, you can see melanoma found under the fingernails, the toenails, the palms of the hands even, and even the soles of the feet. EMR, or electromagnetic radiation, sometimes called EM as well, this is energy in the form of transverse magnetic and electrical waves. And there's health risks associated with being exposed to these electromagnetic fields or radiations. It's very controversial, and the early concerns were with radar and other radio and microwave sources. Now, what are the biological effects of non-ionizing radiation? Well, it's been difficult to establish, particularly the effects of long-term low-level exposures. So think about just having just a little bit of exposure for many, many years. And there has been recent emphasis on the potential effects of low-intensity fields, intermediate radio frequencies, and higher frequency radiation from things like our cell phones, broadcast antennas, Wi-Fi, security monitors, and other things. Think about Bluetooth, anything that's emitting some type of electric wave. It may or may not be carcinogenic. The jury is still out, though you will find many articles that are suggesting that exposures to these devices do increase our risk for cancer. Now we're moving on to infection, sexual, and reproductive behavior. And there are certain viruses, bacteria, and parasites that contribute to cancer. Of the 14 million new cancer cases that were reported about a decade ago, 2.2 million were due to carcinogenic infections. So, what are carcinogenic infections? Worldwide, the most significant infection is H. pylori, or Helicobacter pylori, about 92%. Then we see human papillomavirus, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and then Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV. Now, going back to H. pylori for a second, it's the most significant infectious cause of cancer in countries with high and very high development. Now, liver cancers are attributable to hepatitis B and hepatitis C virus, and it varies greatly with indices of human development index, meaning whether it's in high development regions or not. But it is linked to these viruses are linked to liver cancer, HBV and HCV. Okay, so hepatitis B, hepatitis C. But hepatitis B was more significant than hep C as a cause for liver cancer in areas with low or medium human development index. Now, the opposite was true in countries with high and very high HDI because of the early spread of Hep C in some of these countries with very high HDIs, or Human Development Index. HPV, or the human papillomavirus, is the most common sexually transmitted virus here in the US and extremely very common worldwide even. About 14 million people are infected with HPV every year, and 79 million Americans currently are infected with HPV, and most sexually active women and men are going to be infected at some point in their lives and then reinfected repetitively. HPV, these viruses are a group of more than 200 related strands of virus, and 13 are cancer causing. Now, HPV is mainly transmitted through sexual contact, and most people that are infected with HPV are going to be infected shortly after the onset of sexual activity. High risk or oncogenic HPVs, remember, there's many types. Well, it's type 16 and type 18 that are the most risky for cancer or oncogenic. It causes about 70% of the cervical cancers and precancerous cervical lesions that are found during health assessments. Human papillomavirus is also linked to anal cancers, cancers of the vulva, vagina, and the penis as well. It caused more than half of the total infection attributable cancers in women worldwide. The Pap test is a test that we use to screen for cervical cancer that is caused often by human papillomavirus. Now we are going to end the presentation in talking about chemical and occupational hazards. And the list of these chemicals can go on and continues to expand as we understand more about these cancer-causing chemicals in our everyday environment. Now, the cancer risks related to workplace situations include ergonomic, organizational, and biologic factors. So what's an ergonomic factor? Like if you have a job that induces a sedentary lifestyle, you sit at the desk all day. Or organizational means like you work in shifts, like nurses. You are either at the morning shift or the day shift, or the night shift. And then biological factors can include infectious agents that you're working with, or if you're around in what we call endocrine disruptors, agents that can block some of our endocrine pathways. Now, when we have these exposures to chemicals that happen every single day, this increases our risk as well. And this can be present in air, soil, food, water, household products that we choose to buy and use, our toys, personal care products like makeup, shampoo, and where we work and where we live. The number of carcinogens that are known is experimental. In animals, it's very large. Things that we're currently testing. So therefore, this list continues to expand as we find more information. And it's suspected that most of these chemical carcinogens are not only affecting the animal studies, but are potentially carcinogenic in humans, but we don't have enough documentation yet. But we do know about asbestos. It increases the risk of what we call asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma. And you might have seen commercials for law firms that are looking for patients that currently have mesothelioma. And it's probably because they either worked in a building or lived in a building or were exposed to asbestos. And usually these buildings were built before the 1970s. And asbestos can be found in ceiling tiles, flooring, even pipe covers. And we've been using it for decades, and it's found in thousands of commercial products, fireproofing materials. We find it in our brakes of our cars and our trucks. Asbestos can be found in textiles, so like our clothing, can be found in particles of cement and things that make up our walls, like drywall. And in Europe, the epidemic of mesothelioma was so large in building workers and other workers that are born after 1940, but it wasn't apparent until about the 1990s. So that's how much latency asbestos has, about 50 years of continual exposure before something manifested. We also know that carcinoma of the bladder, or bladder cancer, has been linked to dyes, rubber, paint. We have some aromatic amines, so things that are found in our beauty products that causes aromas. We also see it in benzyl inhalation being linked to leukemia in patients that may have taken an occupation as a shoemaker, or they are working with rubber, cement, explosives, or in some type of dyeing industry. Think about textiles. Other occupational hazards include heavy metals like high nickel alloy or chromium compounds, inorganic arsenic, silica, sulfuric acid, occupational exposure to diesel exhaust, which we've talked about, underground miners, and other chemicals in that field have been linked to eye and nose irritation, headaches, nausea, and asthma. So these things are very big and sometimes overlooked. But I also want to challenge you to think about something called sick building syndrome. And sick building syndrome is something that needs to be studied more, but can occur even in our everyday lives. Think about the first time you moved to an older home. Maybe there was asbestos in your living area and you didn't know. Or maybe there were carcinogens in the paint. But it also occurs with moving or living or working in newer buildings. When new paint goes up, new flooring, new drywall, all of these things start to off-gas chemicals and can also increase the risk for cancers. So it's not just in the old things, but it's also in the new things as well. So as these things get studied and we increase this list and expand on what we know to be carcinogenic, we will have not only a greater understanding, but also we're going to be plagued with, what really is carcinogenic and where we can actually be free of carcinogens. We're going to practice. Our last question is: a change in lifestyle factors or controlling bacterial infection from H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori is responsible for a decrease in which type of cancer? So basically it's asking us, if we can control H. pylori, what can we decrease? Which of these cancers? Lung cancer, stomach cancer, leukemia, or colorectal? Now, hopefully you can think about where H. pylori is often found, and that is in the digestive tract. So stomach cancer in the US has dropped dramatically, actually, as we are learning how to make lifestyle changes that can control bacterial infections from H. pylori. Now, lung cancer rates have risen and fallen that parallel the prevalence of smoking, and radiation-induced cancers can include some leukemias. And low intake of folic acid is actually what is correlated to the increased risk of colorectal cancer. So make sure that you have enough folic acid in your diet to decrease the risk of colorectal cancer. So again, the answer here, H. pylori is connected to the digestive tract and stomach cancers.